Gregory Jones, QC, is a practicing barrister in the UK. In addition to that, he's a visiting fellow at the Centre of European Law at King's College London, and he's also a member of the Governing House Council of St Stephen's House, Oxford University. Finally, he's also an elected alderman of the City of London. Greg, we're very pleased to have you talking to us from in the UK, and we're very much looking forward to hearing about this inner detail of one of Churchill's dramatic plans during the Second World War.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's from a slightly wet Kent I'm addressing you in England, and behind me in our house, the black and white background is of the 17th century grotesque. The house that we're living in now does have links with France, though it's quite appropriate. The stones for Canterbury Cathedral were landed at the foot of our garden and dragged through the garden. It wasn't a garden then, by the Normans. I want to talk about, though, today, something that I think certainly in Britain and France is a bit of history that certainly in the current political climate we choose to forget. And that's Churchill's offer of a Franco British Union in 1940. Around about this time last year, you may recall, President Macron made his first lockdown overseas visit to London to meet with Prime Minister Boris Johnson to commemorate the 80th anniversary of de Gaulle's famous BBC speech to the people of France, that they had lost the battle but not lost the war, and to encourage the French nation to fight on. Johnson announced MBEs to various French resistance veterans that were still alive in defending the UK and France from Nazi Germany. And Macron, in turn, presented London with the Légion d'honneur in gratitude for the British role in housing leaders of the Free French forces in the Second World War, and obviously helping to direct joint resistance operations inside France with SOE, Special Operations Executive, and other organizations. But such are our relationships. The Times couldn't resist quoting from the public comments on Le Figaro's website when the plan to award the Légion d'honneur to London was announced. And the Times said, judging by Le Figaro's website, users were indignant at the suggestion that he wanted to honor what one called hereditary enemies. Many said the Légion d'honneur, which, as many of you know, was created by Napoleon in 1802 in a brief respite pause between wars against Britain. Napoleon Bonaparte must be turning in his grave. Apparently, one of the contributors said, he who created this medal exiled to St. Helena by the same people we're now going to honor. Neither Johnson or Macron, to my knowledge, made any mention of the fact, but for a possibility of a different outcome in history, they could have been celebrating the 80th anniversary of a new European superpower. And indeed, as we come into May and June, we could be looking forward to the 81st anniversary. So what my talk is, first of all, is a bit about why it came about, why that offer came about, also why it failed, and something about a little indulgence in counterfactual history, which is always fun, the what if it succeeded. And then also something about why this is something that both countries choose to forget. And not only this offer of union, but I'll come on in the end just briefly to talk of another offer of union made by the Premier of France post-Suez. It's debatable whether many Frenchmen ever heard de Gaulle's famous speech, and I'll come on to talk about its circumstances a little bit in a moment. But of course, de Gaulle himself, famously or infamously, was no fan of the Anglo-Saxons, and that's not just the British, but also the Americans. Famously, he wrote a book on the French army, which didn't mention the Battle of Waterloo at all. And relationships between de Gaulle and Churchill were always quite mixed. When de Gaulle left London in 1943 to set up his headquarters in Algeria, he gave no thanks at all to Britain for having hosted him and having helped create the Free French Forces. Just by aside, his relationships with the American was even worse, with Franklin D. Roosevelt. And both Roosevelt and Churchill in 1943 did plot, and I'll say something about that later, to try and replace de Gaulle as the leader of the French forces. And that, quite rightly, did not succeed, and they backed down. I just digress a little bit. There's the famous conversation 20 years later, when de Gaulle, many of you will recall, withdrew the French from the NATO military alliance in the 1960s. With very short notice, expected all military personnel, Americans, to leave Paris, where the headquarters was, and reportedly phoned up Lyndon B. Johnson, demanding that NATO move its headquarters, and that it was his intention that all American service personnel should be removed from French soil by that date. It is said that Johnson replied, "Does that include the servicemen buried in it?" So there is a tension, which I'll come back to, that explains, I think, some of the difficulties that the Anglo-Saxons, but the British and the French have. Some of it's to do with our similarities and our misplaced, my view, sense of continued empirical grandeur. Let's then look, though, a little step back before we go to 1940. Because it's very easy to think so much in modern nationalistic terms, but the nation state is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. It is true to say that of the 450 years up to the end of Napoleon, England and then Britain had been at war with France for 164 years. And that includes battling from the Cinque Ports, where I'm speaking to you from, to Crécy, to the two extended wars in Europe, overseas in North America, the North American 7 Years' War, prior between Britain and France in North America, which led to Britain capturing what is now Canada, began when a junior British colonial officer lost control of his Native American scouts in a skirmish on the border with the French colony. Interestingly, that officer was George Washington, who later went on to different things. But the French and the British had fought in India, Africa, the West Indies, and there was even obviously a battle as to where the center of the world should be. And obviously we won with Greenwich. But it is also a fact that throughout that period, there's been a tendency to characterize each other's nations. So A.J.P. Taylor notes that Napoleon described the English as men who were continually at the table, almost always intoxicated, an uncommunicative disposition. I think Samuel Johnson got his revenge in first, or retaliation in first, by describing a Frenchman must always be talking, whether he knows anything of the matter or not. An Englishman is content to say nothing when he has nothing to say. So you can see already these characters, as nationalism was developing, these images, whether based on truth or otherwise, were developing not just of economic and political rivals, but almost as different races. And both countries at various times strove to be top dog. The British are equally to be blamed for misplaced haughty grandeur. I mean, we continued with the title for the British monarchy as being also King of France right up until the Act of Union with Ireland in 1801. We'd lost Calais, the last foothold, centuries before. Napoleon himself and the French are no less guilty. I mean, Napoleon in his memoirs on the Battle of Waterloo expressed sympathy for the British people and the people of London in particular when they learned of the catastrophe which had befallen their army at Waterloo. So interesting parallels there, I think, of a little bit of self-delusion. And the reason I'm going back to some of this, because when we look at what happened in 1940, some of these prejudices on both sides, I suggest, came out. Nonetheless, one has to recognize the special qualities of both Churchill and de Gaulle on key issues. For all their bickering, de Gaulle, in his speech to the French to fight on in 1940, described Churchill as the leader of the British Empire and had great respect for him. But he saw him very much through his own eyes of having the qualities which he admired, but thinking they were only for Britain and that Churchill would not have any love or desire for France. And I think that's a difference between them. And in some senses, it was a fault of Churchill's. He wasn't in that respect sometimes as ruthless as he should have been. So how was it then, if we go back, we just had a little look then at the fact that a Franco British Empire is not as surprising or as unique as one would think. This is looking back to the Angevin Empire, the Plantagenet Empire under Henry II. And you can see there, we don't have Wales there, we don't have Scotland, but a sizable Anglo-French empire. And there we see Richard the Lionheart and the French king, Philip Augustus. I mean, the Franks, of course, as you see from the map before, their control was to the east of France. The prospect, therefore, of some form of Anglo-French alliance in the form of a state is not so bizarre as we now all like to think. I turn now to why did Churchill make the offer? And I think that can be described in one word: desperation. Most of us, such as my generation, and even now, there'll be very few alive now who actually lived through the war other than as children. But we grew up, particularly in Britain, with the post-war notion of what the Second World War was about. We didn't have so many TV screens, but I can remember reruns of the Dam Busters, Bridge on the River Kwai, etc., etc. It was, and I pick up from an article written by Joe Johnson, now Lord Johnson, ennobled by his elder brother. So nepotism still exists, perhaps, in this country, but remember, it's only kin deep. But Joe Johnson said this, and I think it's quite right. There is a bit of a myth authored by Winston Churchill and the Labour Party afterwards that the Second World War was like a three-act morality tale. Starts with paper-waving Conservative Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's failure to stand up to Hitler's aggressive foreign policy until it was too late, and plunges us into a destructive war. Act 2 sees salvation by Churchill, supported by a patriotic Labour Party and plucky British public, who steer the country through years of struggle to victory. And then the denouement sees the British public elect a more egalitarian post-war society, the New Jerusalem. So it's a bit like when you go and see Lord of the Rings, 3 books, you know that at the end, Frodo's going to succeed. But the point was, at the time, there was no benefit of historical hindsight. And when we talk of the darkest hour, I don't think we really appreciate it as much as some of those who were living through it. Some of you may remember the barrister, future MP, Ery Neve, who was a barrister at the Nuremberg trials and was the first British officer to escape from Colditz. He was later blown up in his car by the IRA in the house, coming out of the Houses of Parliament. As a young subaltern, he was one of the ones left behind at Calais during the retreat to Dunkirk. And they had run out of basically anything to do. They were just waiting to be captured, and because they were part of the no evacuation group. And he heard a rifle shot and they all hid for cover, thinking it was the Germans, but it was actually a young British soldier who had just in despair committed suicide. And that seems a little bit odd for us to comprehend now. But if one puts it into a modern equivalent, it's not so unbelievable. The historian Anthony Beevor says that public morale in May 1940 was steady only because they were ignorant of the true state of affairs. And we had operating in Britain, you may have heard of this mass observation organization, which is very good. They had individual people, different classes, noting down what people were saying. It's interesting to say that mass observation noted that the mood was more resistant in rural areas and that the middle classes were more nervous than the working classes, but the greatest proportion of defeatists were amongst the rich and upper classes. I think as well, there's another myth that we need to disperse, is that the British Army, the BEF, was under-equipped, or that the Germans had better equipment. The British Army, the BEF, was a small professional army and was excellently equipped. It was entirely mechanized, which was certainly not the case of the Germans. In fact, of the 135 German divisions used in the attack of the West, only 16 were mechanized. So the notion that they're all in panzers and blitzkrieg is a slight misconception. The other 119 used horses and their foot, soldiers just walking. The British tanks were superior probably at that stage than the Germans, although our radio systems were not very good. But we had proportionally more radio sets than the French. When Hitler's field marshals, von Bloch, saw the wreckage at Dunkirk, he said, "Here lies the material of a whole army, so incredibly well equipped that we poor devils could only look on with amazement." And we left equipment in France that was recycled by the Germans in Poland. I won't give you all the statistics, but they included nearly 500,000 tons of stores and nearly 70,000 vehicles. But having said that, we don't want to go to the other extreme. It was well equipped, it was entirely mechanized, but it was incredibly small. And that was the problem. It doesn't matter that the German army wasn't 100% mechanized. It still dwarfed the British army completely. The fact that the BEF was 10 divisions meant that it could only ever play a supporting role at that stage. And the key issue was whether the Belgian and French forces would be able to hold the ground. Now, this gets on to a delicate subject between Anglo and French relationships, because in the evacuation of Dunkirk and the fall of France resulted in another Anglo-French blame game. And that's something I want to come on to briefly. Before I do so, just to explain the slides, that's Waterloo Station. Many of you recognize not much has changed, but the in and out has gone. There's Churchill and Clementine at Waterloo Station. I don't think it's the actual time that he was about to go to France, which I'm going to come on to in a moment, but she did accompany him to the station. I think we need to understand about Dunkirk. Dunkirk represented another major rift between the French and the British. You've got a picture on the left, the British and French soldiers being evacuated, in fact, a naval rating. The point about that, first of all, is that there was confusion over who was going to evacuate whom, and indeed whether it was an evacuation or whether Dunkirk was to remain as a bridgehead to then supply and carry on fighting. There was, unfortunately, one of the British generals was quite anti-French, but at one stage most reluctant to bring any French soldiers aboard because every Frenchman was a Britishman left on the beaches, he said. But in the end, there was co-evacuation by the Royal Navy. Why was there so little French presence at Dunkirk in terms of naval presence? It's because under the alliance, the French were mainly to look after the Mediterranean and the British were mainly to look after the Channel and the North Sea. So it was no particular surprise that the French fleet was not there in big numbers. When you read accounts by British officers and soldiers at Dunkirk, you hear lots of criticism of the way in which the evacuation was organized. But nonetheless, one can't underestimate the bravery and the ability of those that managed to evacuate what was initially tens of thousands of troops, and then in the end, a couple of 100,000 of troops. I just pause to say this, and many of you may already know it. Well, I grew up believing that was it. When we evacuated from Dunkirk, there was no longer any British presence in northern France, apart from those soldiers like Erigny who had been left behind. That's not the case. I mean, the middle leaflet in the middle is a German propaganda one that they dropped on the British and French shoulders, showing that they were surrounded. Churchill was desperate to keep France in the war. Time doesn't permit to go through the shuttle that took place in Churchill's Flamingo aeroplane, where he was shuttling to and from Paris to try and keep the French government in the war and committed to fighting on. And it was in one of his last flights to France that at the meetings between the British and French, Churchill was promising another BEF to be landed. One has heard about the stories that the French requested also further Spitfires to be sent and Hurricanes to be sent to help in the Battle of France. And Churchill was minded to say yes, but then Hugh Dowding, head of fighter command, refused. Churchill backed down, and that story is relatively well known. The story that isn't so well known is Churchill's insistence that we land further troops in France, which we did. We didn't have many, so the 1st Canadian Division made up most of the landing. Many of them were untrained. They had equipment, but many of them hadn't even been trained how to operate the equipment. And they were landed back into France after Dunkirk. It was done by Churchill because he wanted to keep France in the war, and he wanted to show a gesture of solidarity with France, that Britain and the Empire was committed to fighting. It was against the advice of the War Cabinet. It was against the advice of military advisors. And it was only the Ulsterman general who persuaded Churchill to withdraw these troops. Otherwise, they were withdrawn in June. So the whole episode was a complete waste of time. They were embarked into northern France and then later withdrawn. The withdrawal was a good idea because they would have just been captured. But the bad thing about landing them was the withdrawal meant they left brand new equipment to just be used by the Germans. I put up one of those things. It's a bit like the American cheese-eating surrender monkeys. The fall of France has left in the Anglo-French history a difficult set of relationships. It's also true that only 3,000 of the many tens of thousands of French who were evacuated from Dunkirk remained to actually fight in the Free French forces. Many of them were repatriated back to France after Dunkirk. Now, that brings me on to another aspect, as we'll come on to see about de Gaulle. As a matter of law, the French government, as we'll see, capitulated with the Germans. So those French officers and men who were repatriated in one sense and who didn't join the Free French forces were acting in one sense entirely in accordance with the law and their nation's wishes. On the left here is Renaud, who was the French leader at the time, and he had a mistress who apparently wasn't very attractive. There's the best picture I can get of her, and she was a pro-fascist. And Renaud was committed to fighting on, but his mistress had persuaded him, it is said, to recruit into the French cabinet those that wanted to appease, who were pretty anti-British, such as Pétain and Wenger, who were anti any thought of resistance. At one of the meetings I mentioned to you when Churchill was shuttling between the two countries, Renaud's mistress is said to have brought out a knife, a small knife that she had under her sophisticated dress, and tried to attack Winston Churchill, screaming that he was bleeding France dry. She wasn't, as some reports say, killed by Churchill's bodyguard, but she was later almost decapitated in a car accident with Renault as they were escaping in Vichy, France. Churchill had reached a position, therefore, that the British forces were being withdrawn. He wanted a desperate act to stop the French from surrendering. And one of the key aspects of that was the French fleet. So the order of events is slightly different to what one would expect in the pictures I'm showing you here of the Germans marching into Paris as being upon the capitulation of the French government. That's not so. The French government evacuated Paris and then went to Bordeaux, and the German army occupies Paris then on the 14th of June, 1940. For Churchill, obviously, and for the world, the fall of Paris to the Germans is a devastating event. When one thinks of the Franco-Prussian War and the siege of Paris, and then one sees the Germans effectively walking into Paris, and when one thinks of the First World War, where obviously the Germans hoped to, with the Schlieffen Plan, knock out Paris early on, failed to, and that led to the lengthy First World War. The efforts, as I said, of Churchill to prop up the French government meant that he, contrary to advice, sought to reconstitute the British Expeditionary Force. At the time of the evacuation of Paris on the 10th of June, there were 150,000 British and Canadian troops in France. So this period between the 10th and the 14th was critical. And as I say, it was Ulsterman General Brooke and his robust character that forced Churchill to withdraw the 150,000 British and Canadian troops in France. Now, I have a small family connection with Dunkirk because my grandfather's brother was evacuated from Dunkirk and won the military medal in the action just before Dunkirk. But one of the problems with that gesture politics was that much valuable equipment was lost. It also meant that the anti-Churchill elements in the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, Halifax and others, who thought that Churchill was overly romantic and unrealistic, gained power. And it was the Labour element, it was the Clement Attlees and the others who stood by Churchill, not only remaining in support of him, but also cautioning him against some of the worst excess. Churchill was hoping desperately for American support in some form for the French, and in his visits that I mentioned, shuttling back between, in Flamingo, his aeroplane, Paris and London, he was also corresponding with Roosevelt, as with the French, in order to get the Americans to take some set stance. He sought from Roosevelt public support, including a declaration of war during this period. And on the 15th of June, Churchill was considering flying to Bordeaux in order to actually make arrangements for the handover of the French fleet. He didn't in the end go. It's suggested by some, but I think wrongly, that if he had gone on that day, maybe this offer of union may have worked. I don't believe it would have done. How was it then that Churchill ended up at Waterloo Station? How do we see these stamps? And if anyone finds out how these stamps were issued and whether they were contemporary or not, I'd be most grateful. It seems bizarre that we should be devoting our time to producing stamps for this new country. But you see them, they're rather nice. And you see the French president and George VI in two different versions. How did this all come about? Churchill was desperate, as I said. He'd had to withdraw the Anglo-Canadian forces. He was desperate for the French not to capitulate. And he met with de Gaulle, and de Gaulle said that a bold gesture was necessary. Now, in the background, there had been Anglo-French civil servants, and this is a whole other story, who'd been meeting, including Jean Monnet, who many of you will know was the founder of the EC and then the European Union, had been beavering away on the idea of a Franco British Union. And they persuaded de Gaulle to back it. At lunch at the Carlton Club with Churchill, Churchill was persuaded that a Franco-British Union, a dramatic gesture, and of course, Churchill enjoyed dramatic gestures, could be the thing to keep the French in the war. He telephoned Renault in France, and he was excited about the prospect as well. Little did he know that Pétain and the pro-Nazi, more peacemaker, had the line tapped. And also he spoke about the idea to his mistress, who disseminated the idea to the pro-German or pro-surrender elements in his cabinet. So the offer lost its dramatic impact. Churchill set off from Downing Street with Clement Attlee. The leaders of all the British political parties had agreed. The cabinet was behind it, and his wife, Clement Churchill, accompanied him to the station. The train was set. He got on it at Waterloo. It was going to go to Southampton. There was going to be a destroyer that would take them to Bordeaux, and it would have been signed and sealed. We know that it was rejected. Pétain infamously described union with Britain like marriage to a corpse. And Renault lost the vote. He was replaced. And Pétain then, as we know, asked for peace. And the top picture there next to the one of Hitler by the Eiffel Tower shows the French being humiliated and made to sign the unconditional surrender in the same railway carriage that the Germans had had to do in the First World War. Hitler then, as you know, had that carriage burned. And you see from the world's press, got an American newspaper, Hitler's success perils US. Remember, the US didn't declare war, of course, and did not enter the war for another couple of years. What then happened was the sinking of the French fleet by the Royal Navy, which led to great historical bitterness. But given that there were hardly any French sailors who were prepared to serve under Royal Naval Command, in my judgment, the British were left with very little option. The admiral who commanded it said it was the worst day in the history of the Royal Navy. There's some little trivia. This chap here is the most successful French fighter ace of the Second World War. He was successful initially in 1940. He then continued with the Vichy forces, and most of his kills were British and American. And it is right as well that the British ended up and the Americans fighting Vichy French in North Africa, and of course, even rather absurdly in Madagascar. What would union have meant then? On its face, this would have been the United Kingdom, Dominions, and France. Would it have stopped a French surrender? I don't think it would have. I don't think there's any chance that the French would not have surrendered. But what would it have meant for the continuation of the war? I think counterfactual history, we might not have had the sinking of the French fleet. That would have meant a lack of bitterness. We might not have had so many French forces prepared to fight for Vichy, but I think we probably still would have. But I think what it would have done would have removed a great deal of bitterness that existed. If you push counterfactual history further, who knows? There was another offer of Anglo-French Union from the French Premier post-Suez, offered to make the Queen of France. He hadn't socialized it with his cabinet or with the French people. So the prospect of an Anglo-French Union in the 1950s, post-Suez, is probably equally remote. Neither country really prepared to face the realities of post-imperialism. But what would have happened if the Union had gone ahead? I'm not going to talk about Africa. You guys can pontificate and think about counterfactual history there. But let's look at some of the colonies. It's not very well known, but the British did fight in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh formed his Communist Party in 1941. In 1945, proclaimed liberation with the fall of Japan of its rule by France. France wasn't immediately in a position to reoccupy Vietnam. So the British sent an Indian brigade of partly Anglo-Indian forces and fought against Ho Chi Minh from 1945 to 1946, and then handed over to France. But what would have happened if it'd been a Franco British country that was seeking to recapture these colonies? What would Frangleterre have been? And I just leave you with some statistics there by comparing the two sites. The reality, as we know, is that the antipathy or the tensions remain between the two countries. But if you look at some of those figures, you can see superficially the attraction of such a union. I just leave you with one last note. Those of you who read the Financial Times will have seen this weekend Simon Cooper's article on the French and the British. He's not referring to 1940. Simon Cooper is he's born in Southern Africa, actually, a contemporary of mine at university who is Anglo-Dutch, living in Paris. His father taught in the Dutch university, so he speaks Dutch as well. And his view is this: certainly as we stand now, the French are too prone to the catastrophe. You may have read that there were ex-generals in France even talking about a coup a few weeks ago against Macron. But by comparison, the British are too complacent. And whether or not the histrionics of the French in 1940 and the defeatism was a factor, British complacency, as Beaver said, the British really knew and appreciated the situation they were in, may not have been so stoic, may have been a reason. Don't forget this, and I'll leave you with this about Winston Churchill. When he left Paris in his Flamingo the last time, and having replied to General Smuts that with the fall of France, Britain would hope that Hitler would destroy his air force against the Royal Air Force in what was to be the Battle of Britain. Generally, he was with General Galt said, yes, and we'll keep fighting on. Churchill turned to him, and there's no reason, historians say, to doubt that it's true. He said, in 3 months, we'll both be dead. And that was when he left Paris, 1940. He was not to set foot in France again until June 1944, when he followed the troops on the beaches of Normandy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. Thank you for explaining a very important part of the inner history of the Second World War and giving us some idea of the tensions between the protagonists at that point in time. What I would like to ask, to get the questions going, were the general public in Britain aware that something as dramatic as this was in the offing?
The short answer is no. I think, as the mass observation polls show, the public were not hugely well informed. The Simon Cooper article that I referred to over the weekend in the FT quotes from one of the daily newspapers, sports column, that when the fall of Paris to the Germans was announced, the comment was, well, that's a shame, but it shouldn't interrupt the race card unduly. There was a degree in that sense of complacency. When the offer was made, it wasn't kept secret. So in Winston Churchill's speech that he made, I think on the same day or pretty close to de Gaulle's famous speech in 1940, that if the British Empire were to last 1,000 years, earlier in that speech, he refers expressly to the offer of union with France, and that the hope that even though he'd been rejected, that they might think better and take it up. but he referred publicly in Parliament in that month to that offer in that famous speech. But that part of the speech, when we get the famous Churchill quotations. So the public were made aware of it formally. How much consciousness they had of it, I don't think is very much, but it was made public in Parliament.
Anyone else like to ask questions or make a comment, please?
What was the relationship between de Gaulle and Reynaud and Pétain during this period that you're talking about?
It's an interesting question. There's an interesting biography of de Gaulle. In many ways, they had similar backgrounds and characters. Military, quite right-wing, Roman Catholic, and they had come across each other before. The difference was this: de Gaulle was not prepared to surrender. And remember, I said I'd touch on it, and in fact I didn't. When de Gaulle, in 1940, he had just been promoted as a brigadier general. I think he was defense minister, but he was not the prime minister, he was still less the president, and he was not commander of any of the forces. And when Pétain became head of the government and negotiated the surrender, de Gaulle was seen as a traitor. And in fact, he was court-martialed in his absence. And so the relationship then was obviously very, very bad. De Gaulle had no legal legitimacy when he made the broadcast, because if you think about it, under the rules of war, France had declared war on Germany and lost, and its democratically elected, or through its constitution, government had agreed surrender terms with the Germans. De Gaulle had no legitimacy legally at all. It's interesting that Churchill appreciated some of de Gaulle's difficult characteristics. He was quite awkward. He, in many sense, an old-fashioned person, didn't want to talk about his family, refused to allow Cecil Beaton, the famous British photographer, to take photographs of him and his children for the British to use for propaganda. Churchill immediately commissioned one of the top British advertising agencies, and the UK government paid £500 for de Gaulle to have an image makeover. And de Gaulle didn't really like this and said, Churchill wants to sell me as a bar of soap. But the relationship between Vanguard and Pétain and de Gaulle obviously became very bad. And I think the position would have been that if de Gaulle had gone back to France, he would have been imprisoned and executed. It's also the case that in 1943, Churchill was getting very fed up of de Gaulle. I mean, variously, de Gaulle would not allow SOE, for example, to use French agents. French-Canadian accent betrayed many of them, but de Gaulle would not allow Free French officers to operate in SOE. And in 1943, there was an attempt, which I mentioned in my talk, by both Roosevelt and Churchill to replace de Gaulle. De Gaulle enjoyed a lot of the characteristics that Pétain had and others in the French that were anti the so-called Anglo-Saxons and very precious of France's sort of military prestige and history. But the crucial difference was he was not prepared to surrender. He, at various times, it sounded very grand. Why was he here? He was asked by Monet's wife. Monet's wife was in London with the exile embassy and asked de Gaulle why he was there. He was there for the honor of France. He said to the French governor, I think of Martinique, but I may be wrong, that he was trying to build a life raft for France. But many of his characteristics, ironically, arguably were very similar to those of the French establishment that were keen to appease.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up question. So Churchill would not have consulted de Gaulle about the idea of a union, is that correct?
No, he did. He met, as I said, de Gaulle at the Carlton Club. And in fact, it wasn't de Gaulle's idea. The idea of the union had come from the work of people like Jean Monnet. There were also other British civil servants as well, who had been working on it. Monet approached de Gaulle. Leo Emery was one of the ones, and Tonenby, British, who also had been working on it and also approached Churchill. And it was discussed at the lunch at the Carlton Club. So Churchill's involvement in this offer came very, very late. The offer was complete union with France, so that every British subject would be a French citizen. There would be joint heads of state. They would work out, the parliament would be in London, well, that would be sort of joint parliament, and they would work out the other matters and constitution later. That's why I'm a bit hesitant to suggest that the stamps that I showed you genuinely printed. I thought they would have had better things to do than printing stamps, but I can never trust my countrymen not to get their priorities right. We're a keen, flashy country. But no, de Gaulle was behind it, and he spoke to him. What he didn't tell de Gaulle, and which de Gaulle was very bitter about, because there were Free French forces involved, de Gaulle was kept out of key decisions certain times. So, for example, the exact date and timing of the D-Day landings was kept from de Gaulle later on in 1944, and there were other instances of that. But on this issue, the union with France had de Gaulle's complete support. One can only imagine how it would have lasted if it had come about, even in the early stages. But, you know, there are stranger things that have happened. But he was behind it. Churchill was behind it. The leaders, his cabinet, were enthusiastically behind it. And all the leaders of the main opposition parties, so Labour and the Liberals, were also supporting it and were on the train with Churchill when the message came that Renault had lost the vote, and Churchill got off the train and they just went back to Downing Street, as has been recorded, with a heavy heart.
How far had the train got?
Nowhere. It had some engine problems which had held it up, but those had been fixed. But it never got out the platform. It was a train that never left the station. It's not true, by the way, that Churchill, and I won't go into the details of it, it's often said that Churchill had said that if he died before de Gaulle, and de Gaulle was then back as president of France and would have come to his state funeral, that he would insisted that his body be brought from Waterloo Station. The famous speech by de Gaulle was made on the exact day of the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. But the story that, and Churchill's coffin did come from Waterloo Station, it's not true that this was a deliberate thing by Churchill. I won't get into the details, but it's all to do with the railway connections and how. But that's the story that's gone about. But this train never left Waterloo Station. It had a bit of engine trouble, and they never got to Southampton. And the I don't know whether it's a destroyer or cruiser. Different accounts say different things, but never left. There was, however, at the time, there were people like Monet and others working away on a federal structure. This is really a different story. It's quite important to know that, I suppose, why the idea was even there. And a lot of it goes back to, and notwithstanding Brexit and anti-federalism, the British school of federalism goes back to the imperial times, with strong links with South Africa, with Milner's kindergarten and Lord Lothian, who's part of Milner's kindergarten. And this effort, at the first, it was driven by the effort of British imperialists to try and see how the empire could survive. They all knew there were going to be troubles. And the idea of creating a federal structure. That then moved on to a European structure. After the First World War, there was a body known as Federal Union. And it was huge in Britain. The support for a European Union amongst the public. There were offices from Glasgow to Bexley Heath, where I grew up. After the First World War, there were groups for Federal Union with Europe, because people just didn't want to go back to the bloodshed of the First World War. And equally, the Second World War, First and Second World War, killed Europe as imperial powers. Britain went into the Second World War as a net creditor nation, left as a debtor nation, The Americans sent their cruiser to get the last gold bars from South Africa and return as part of the Lend-Lease. And we only paid that off under Gordon Brown, the money we owed to America under Lend-Lease. They've still got all the bases. We mustn't have any mistake about what the Second World War meant for Europe. Some may say the good riddance, but it meant, you know, the rise of the US and Soviet Union, Cold War, and now China. There should be no mistake that for Britain as a global power, the Second World War, obviously the First World War, was a complete disaster.
I know it's a very, very complex set of relationships, but I'm always struck by de Gaulle's absolute ingratitude, not only for his personal safety in Britain, but also for the rescue of his country. I always find there's something unpleasant about his attitude, just so ungrateful.
Well, there are two things, actually. There's a quotation, I've got it, but I'll paraphrase it. Churchill at one stage said, I suppose rather magnanimously, because he famously compared de Gaulle to the cross of Lorraine, which was a Free French symbol, and de Gaulle was the cross that he had to bear. He also said of de Gaulle, and there is an element of truth in this, and it goes back to the earlier question about de Gaulle's relationship with Pétain and the other French generals and admirals. And it's this: Churchill said, remember, de Gaulle has to show that by his anti-British stance, that he's not in our pocket and he's not a puppet. The only problem is he just does that just too damn well. There is, in fairness, which Churchill did appreciate, one element that de Gaulle had to show that he wasn't a puppet of the British and then the Americans. Remember as well, in post-liberation, at the end of the Second World War, you can read all these accounts of different towns and villages. And this is not to get into the whole resistance issue, but insofar as there was resistance, there was a huge amount in France and elsewhere in Europe, communism and communist resistance, and the plans for them to take over France. I mentioned in 1943, Churchill was getting to the end of his tether with de Gaulle and was looking to remove him. And there are cables that became disclosed under the Official Secrets Act. And Churchill wanted to remove him. And Churchill told Clement Attlee and Anthony Eden in May 1943, so almost to the day, 3 years later, give or take a month, I asked my colleagues to consider urgently whether we should not now, and he uses the word, eliminate de Gaulle as a political force. De Gaulle, Churchill said, and this is in his cable, hates England and has left a trail of Anglophobia behind him everywhere. And he said the man's removal was necessary given Britain's absolutely vital interest in preserving good relations with the United States. Churchill then went on in a personal memo he received from Roosevelt, who described de Gaulle as having messianic complex with dictatorial tendencies. Roosevelt said he had the idea that the people of France are strongly behind him personally. This I doubt. Roosevelt said he didn't know what to do with de Gaulle, telling Churchill possibly you'd like to make him governor of Madagascar. And then Churchill said de Gaulle is thoroughly unfriendly both to Britain and to the United States, whilst affecting communist sympathies, he has fascist tendencies. Now, all of that is no doubt true. He was made to live in Hemel Hempstead when he was in Britain, although Hemel Hempstead is actually rather nice and he rather liked it. But if we try and stand back, because it's very tempting, particularly as a British, to see it all from the Anglo-Saxon side, it may be said, and I go back to the exchange I mentioned with President Johnson and de Gaulle, when de Gaulle, later as president, expelled armed NATO forces from French soil, is this: it may be said that the French are too willing to show themselves to be independent to the world and anti the USA, and the British are too desperate to ingratiate themselves with the USA. It may be said.
Thanks very much, Greg. On behalf of U3A, Greg, can I say thank you very much for obviously the enormous preparation and searching out of visuals and so on, which went into the presentation, and the way in which you've opened up the intricacies of a particular point, which for most of us, including myself, at the time all this took place, I was 15 months old. And here I am today, possibly as a result of what occurred there. But thank you very much for your presentation, and we hope you have a great summer in the UK.